Great to see you this morning, and we had a wonderful evening at Nick's. I hear that the scavenger hunt was a big hit, and I know there's at least one person in this room who clocked in 15,000 steps. So I think that some of you made it pretty close. So congratulations to everybody on that. And also, I just wanted to say that the panels yesterday were excellent. And I was, really pleased with how you all did, looking forward to today. A couple more announcements about what's going to happen later in the day. After the second panel, we're going to have a group photo, so please don't run off. Your checkout time is noon. We should be finished with the photo well before then. And I want to encourage all of you to keep tweeting, keep posting on Instagram. Our hashtag is... Okay, thanks. And then one more thing. Grace, I forgot to bring them up. Can you just show me one of the certificates? And let's see. We do have a couple of keepsakes. I hope all of you have your program from Friday night. If you don't, we have some extras. And we also have certificates for everyone this year. We're going to be passing them out during the break, I mean. And on the back, you have a map of the scavenger hunt. So you can always return to DC and make your way around the city. But we'll give you those during the break. And for now, I want to just introduce this panel, Education and Youth. We'll start with Tori Sousa from the University of Pennsylvania, reporting on Argentina, when connectivity fails, learning derails. Laila Shadid, also from the University of Pennsylvania, Palestinian children under occupation, and Kate Mabus, University of Chicago. Her project is Restitution and Reunification for the Maori People's Stolen Children. Safi El-Gamal from Davidson College, An Emerging Moroccan Identity, Modernity, Language, and Religion. And Emily Cooper from Southern Illinois University Carbondale, reporting on media literacy in Illinois. I'm really pleased that we have several guests here, and I want to note that Safi's advisor, who gave me his card, but I left it on the desk, his name is? Samir Jafar is here, so if anyone, thank you, Samir is right over there. If anyone is interested in finding out more about Middlebury College's language programs in Morocco, you have somebody to talk to during the break. So thanks for coming. Okay, so we'll just go ahead and get started. Go ahead, Tori.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Tori from University of Pennsylvania, and I traveled to Argentina's capital city of Buenos Aires to report on the impact of COVID on public education there. Specifically, I focused on Barrio 31, which is one of the most infamous slums in the city. So I'll just get through some relevant context, and then we'll get into some of the issues students faced during the pandemic. So first, just some statistics so you can note the scope of the problem in numbers. So in Argentina, there's over 4,000 of these neighborhoods, most typically referred to as populous neighborhoods, with about 7 to 10% of families in Argentina living in them. Barrio 31 has about 40,000 residents living in it today. And then to get into some of the issues that students faced. So over 70% of students living in these neighborhoods used WhatsApp, the messaging app, as the primary means of communication with teachers rather than Google Meet or Zoom, as many of us have used. And then over 40% of the households in the city that report lacking internet access are located in the villas. So meanwhile, in the United States, so just for some comparison, so 93% of students were able to attend virtual classes, which obviously, given the statistics I've just shown, is not the same story for students living in Argentina, especially in these populous neighborhoods. And then 99% were able to return to some semblance of in-person learning by December 2021 in the United States. So next I'll get into the digital divide, which was really at the base of this issue during this time of virtual learning throughout the world, and of course in Buenos Aires as well. So my story largely followed the experience of Yasmin Macchio, and she was a student who recently graduated from secondary school, and it followed her family's experience with learning throughout the pandemic. So this is a quote she shared with me to introduce. So she said, the school would hand in these activity books filled with assignments. Lots of kids did not even complete them because the schools were generally not stringent about handing them back and correcting them and offering support. So this was really a multifaceted issue in that not only were most students not able to access these virtual classes at all and had problems with even getting access to phones or computers to talk to their teachers were so overwhelmed with the situation at hand that a lot of times this led to a lack of a learning experience as we know it. So, and then for government aid, so last year the federal government did announce an initiative to distribute over 600,000 computers to children in Argentina to accommodate for the digital divide, and this was a highly politicized issue in the country and the city at large. And then one of the volunteers I spoke to noted that while the computers certainly helped, they couldn't address the issue overall in the way that many of the residents of the barrios populares really needed. And he also talked about access to Wi-Fi, so on top of the access to computers and phones. So Yasmin Macchio, her family, she lives in a household of 11 people, and they don't have access to a computer. So they split the parents' 2 cell phones to access all of their schoolwork, her siblings, her nieces, and her nephews. So as you can imagine, this definitely led to a lot of scheduling conflicts and the like, and the older children in the house needing to take on additional issues. So on top of those things, there was also issues with Wi-Fi connectivity, because largely for the residents in Barrios Populares, including Barrio 31, there's no internet access, so they had to access public sort of places that had Wi-Fi, but these became overcrowded and the problem was further exacerbated. So how students found support. So with family and community support, this was what really struck me about my project. With an issue with so many layers and so many obstacles for families, I was really inspired by Yasmin's story and how much she stepped up to help her siblings, because as is typical in these neighborhoods, both of her parents were working really long hours and not readily accessible to their children while they were completing their schoolwork. So a lot of times older children in households in these bigger families will have to step up to help their siblings. And children also relied really heavily on external assistance from community organizations like the one that's chronicled in my story, Apoyo Escolar, which helps students navigate their coursework after hours. So this is just a quote that I included from one of the volunteers I spoke to that noted that they had the applications necessary installed on their phones. So she was telling a story about 2 brothers here for them to do their schoolwork. Whenever the boys saw them, they asked to use their phones so that they could even access their homework. So that was what they were most concerned with as they showed up to tutoring. Rather than an academic question, they just wanted to use their phones so that they could even get in contact with their teachers in the first place. So that really struck me. And then just some additional barriers that I mentioned in my story. As you can imagine, there was a wave of absenteeism brought on by the pandemic. So Melissa Massinelli, who used to work at the Ministry of Education in Buenos Aires, talked about a heightened number of absences, which led to a pretty significant number of dropouts in local schools. And many children, as is noted in the story, eventually dropped out to help their families make ends meet. And then also school systems as a means of social support there, as Melissa Massinelli explained to me. So she noted that schools adopted things like pick up food baskets to account for families dealing with food insecurity at home to make sure their kids were able to eat. And then also passing without learning. So I'll get into that a bit here. So in a glimpse towards the future, my story, or Yasmin's story as of now, ends with that she was passed by her school despite telling me that herself and many of her friends felt like they hadn't learned anything all year. And in Argentina, to enroll in university, you need to complete a year-long course that is deemed to show that you're ready to take on the rigors of university. Yasmin and a bunch of her friends were unable to complete the course, and Yasmin attributed this to her issues with learning loss throughout the year. But she still lives in Barrio 31 today, helping her siblings to address their schoolwork, and she will graduate flight attendant schooling in December. And she expressed some concerns already about what this means for academic motivation for many of her siblings and other children living in the neighborhood. And she hopes that with community and familial support, all of the children living in these neighborhoods will be able to overcome the issues that they faced in this time. So I would like to thank briefly, as many other fellows have, Kem and Libby for all of their help. This was an amazing experience that I'll never forget. And then also my story has been published in Politico magazine, so my editor, Peter Canellos, is here today, and I would like to shout him out and thank him for all of his support and help. Thank you so much. This was an incredible experience that I'll definitely never forget, so thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Laila Shadid, and I'm here from the University of Pennsylvania's Middle East Center. This past summer, I spent 2 months working in the West Bank in Palestine, and I focused on children's stories and their experiences living under Israeli occupation. So, for those of you who aren't familiar with the contemporary politics of Israel and Palestine, I encourage you to take the next step in learning. This is one of the most important and foundational issues in the Middle East and arguably the world. To give some brief background, I added this graphic that illustrates Palestinian loss of land since the State of Israel was established in 1948. I lived here in the West Bank, you can see the yellow star, land that's technically governed by Palestinians, but is controlled by the Israeli government and its occupation forces. It's controlled through a system of inhumane practices, such as checkpoints, surveillance, arbitrary arrests, a complex ID system that limits Palestinian freedom of movement, and many others. One of these inhumane practices is the use of a physical barrier wall that runs along the border between Israel and the West Bank. It's a separation, or as many call it, an apartheid wall. There's a lot of graffiti, artwork done on this wall. The first photo is from where I lived in Aizaria, and the second photo is from Bethlehem. So I spent the majority of my time in Aizaria. It was a suburb of East Jerusalem in the West Bank on the other side of the wall, and it was victim to the separation wall in 2002. So it used to be connected to Jerusalem, only a 10-minute walk away from the city. And when the wall was built in 2002, it cut the city off from infrastructure, from schools, from hospitals, and basically from its livelihood. So Yeah, it's classified as Area C, which means it's under Israeli military control. And it runs between one of the largest settlements in the West Bank, Male Adumim, and the Separation Wall. So even though it's a growing city, there's no room for it to expand. I spoke with children in both Aizaria and the neighboring town of Abu Dis. My second reporting location was the Dheisheh refugee camp in Bethlehem. It was very different than Aizaria. I interviewed a group of older children here through the Laila Center, which is a community organization for youth in the camp. It was established in 1949 to house Palestinians forcibly displaced from 45 villages in West Jerusalem and outside of Hebron. Bethlehem is considered Area A, under Palestinian control, but Israeli occupation forces raid this camp 3 to 4 times per week. So these children have had direct confrontations with military since they can remember. Some of them as young as 4 or 5 when they had their first memory of raids. So I conducted in-depth interviews with about 17 children from both reporting locations, and they were between the ages of 6 and 17 years old. I also worked with a translator who lived in Aizaria, where I was based, and she was a master's student at Birzeit University. She helped me to conduct these interviews in Arabic, which is the native language of most of these children. And these were some of the questions that guided my work. The main one was, how do Palestinian children conceptualize Israeli occupation? And within that, I asked them questions like, what is your first memory of occupation? Why do you think they built the barrier wall? And what do you think is on the other side of the wall? Here were some of their responses. Take a minute to read through these yourself and pay attention to the ages of these children. I also added here an image that stands at the entrance to most Palestinian villages in the West Bank. It's in Arabic, Hebrew, and English, and it reads, "This road leads to Palestinian village. The entrance for Israeli citizens is dangerous." This struck me immediately upon arrival. This was the first thing I saw when entering the West Bank. One response that stood out to me here was 17-year-old Mohammed's, a boy from the Dheisheh refugee camp. When I asked him what he thinks is behind the separation wall, he gave me a one-word answer: heaven. Mayar, a 15-year-old girl from Abu Dis, said that if the wall was destroyed tomorrow, the first thing she would do is run to tell her father that they can go home. For the multimedia component of my project, I conducted drawing activities with each of the children. I asked them to draw the first thing that comes to their mind when they think of Israeli occupation. Common themes in these drawings included scenes of Israeli soldiers killing Palestinians, blood, death, violence, the Palestinian flag, the separation wall, and Al-Aqsa Mosque, the third holiest site in Islam. Here you can see more drawings of Al-Aqsa. Al-Aqsa is in the old city of Jerusalem in the Muslim quarter. But since the wall was built, many Palestinians cannot see it because they don't have an ID or permit to enter Jerusalem. It's become a site of violence between Palestinians and occupation forces, as you can see depicted in this 8-year-old's drawing. It's also become a symbol of Palestinian resistance. Here are some more explicit images of violence from the Dheisheh camp. It was important for me to understand how children visualize their oppressor. They were able to communicate very, very well at such a young age and tell me a lot of stories, but their drawings added a necessary element. So, if there's anything I would like you to take away from my work, it's that this is not a conflict. This is oppression, and that oppressor is clear. This is a human rights issue, and Palestinian human rights matter. They have been ignored by Western media and the entire world for far too long, often at the censorship of the United States. We are complicit in Palestinian oppression, and the sooner we realize this, the sooner we can change the reality on the ground. The sooner these children will be able to live in peace and security. I chose to focus on Palestinian children because they are some of the most vulnerable victims of Israeli occupation, and their stories are often overlooked. But what I realized is that every single Palestinian adult whether they be in the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, living as second-class citizens in Israel, or one of more than 7 million refugees worldwide, was once a child too. If we imparted the same empathy on them as we do on these children, it would be clear. This is a human rights issue. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Kate, and I traveled to New Zealand to look at how the Indigenous Maori population is reforming the child protection system that for a long time has failed them. So the context you need to know is that 2019 was a watershed moment for New Zealand when story after story started surfacing about how the Child Protection Agency and state care system abused and discriminated against Maori. At the center is this agency, Oranga Tamariki, which translates to well-being, essentially, Oranga, of children, Tamariki. And the older stories are ones of forced assimilation, brutal treatment in state contracted care facilities. Newer stories are ones of custody being taken from parents, children being placed with white foster carers and being deprived of their culture. So I was told it's important to understand that Maori culture is very interdependent, whereas most Anglo-European cultures are more individualistic. And I've included this modernist representation, a painting of whakapapa, which is ancestry, and is important to the Maori identity. And so typically a Maori kid growing up will be connected to their whānau, which is a network of extended family members who take care of them. So when they're disconnected from their community, they lose a support network, a sense of belonging and identity, which leads to isolation and trauma. I've also included this photo of a marae, just because it's cool and will give you a sense of how integral whānau is to everyday Maori life. And the carvings on the walls tell the stories of the iwi, or the tribe, and their genealogy. Although to actually enter a marae, you have to be a member of the tribe and undergo a welcoming ceremony. So this is for tourists. So in recent years, especially since 2019, Maori have been building out their own alternative model of child welfare and social welfare in general, which is culturally grounded, is a simple way to put it. They do housing, health, education, among other things, but I focused on their approach to child welfare and protection. And I would describe the approach as revolutionary, but also intuitive. I think the biggest difference is that the families that are being served are brought into the decision-making process and paired with a social worker from the community, so a social worker who is Maori. And they collaborate together to identify strengths, resource needs, and ultimately reach an agreement on the best placement for the child, which is usually with a trusted family member. And this is compared to how a bureaucratic model of child protection usually runs, which is that a no doubt highly trained but disconnected social worker will come in and hand down a decision, which the default decision is usually removal of the child, which means family separation. And one of the leaders of Whānau Ora I talked to, who's a politician named John Tamaheri, when I spoke with him, he explained the approach as looking for a solution waiting to happen rather than a problem to be punished. So in my reporting, I got to know these two wonderful women. And they're close friends, but they have very opposite personalities, so they're sort of a yin and yang duo. And they met through Fena Ora, which is where they turned when the state had taken away their children, treated them horribly. And I don't have time to do their stories full justice here, but I wanted to tell you a bit about Nicola. Nicola has been very outspoken about her experience. The death of her 3-year-old son, Moko, was highly publicized in New Zealand, and to this day, she's still fighting for justice. So, Moko was placed with abusive caregivers by the paired social worker who neglected to check up on him and failed to protect him ultimately. And while Nicola was filing to get custody back of her children, Moko was hospitalized for the injuries he sustained, and without Nicola's permission, taken off life support by Oranga Tamariki. And a year later, when Nicola finally received his medical records, she found listed under next of kin not her name, but the name of the state agency, which to me is emblematic of the entitlement that the government treats themselves with over Maori lives. And today, Nicola works for Fena Ora in their elderly care division. And she told me that once her kids are grown, she wants to finish her law degree, which she'll use to enforce the rights of her people. So to wrap up, I want to talk about the global significance of this. New Zealand is a small island, and it's far away from here, but Fena Ora is working with Canada's government and First Nations tribes to adapt the model, and they're also working with a few Native tribes in California. So Indigenous sovereignty in child welfare is taking great strides, but actually next month, the US Supreme Court will hear a case on what's called the Indian Child Welfare Act, which for 40 years has been enforcing tribal sovereignty and ensuring that Native kids are paired with Native caregivers. And that's at risk of being overturned. And if we can take what's happened in New Zealand and in American history too, we start to get a sense of the consequences of that. So there's a lot that can be learned from New Zealand. And as my work explores, I think that Fena Ora could be a transformational model for many countries. So thank you for listening.
Hi everyone, I'm Safi El-Gamal. I'm a senior at Davidson College studying religion and Arab studies. And my reporting project was an emerging Moroccan identity, modernity, language, and religion. So I traveled to Rabat, which is the capital of Morocco in the northwest corner of the country. And after getting COVID and having a hefty 2-week COVID quarantine, I was able to start my reporting project on the introduction of English into Moroccan culture and what that means for Moroccan Islamic culture. And so one of my first observations being in Morocco in the fall of 2021, but also coming back in the summer, was that a lot of the people in the older generation just do not speak English. And as somebody who doesn't know French, and my Moroccan Arabic at the time was very shaky, it was just really hard to get around. And so, but as I got to know the Moroccan youth a lot more, I was able to see how there is a very immersive effect of the youth within English. But I was mostly focusing on the Arabic language and the Islamic tradition, and that was seen in a lot of Moroccan cultural practices. This is Moroccan calligraphy. That's the Moroccan font, and you can obviously see that it depends heavily on the Arabic language, but it's also a religious practice, and it practices the value of ihsan, which is the Arabic word for beauty and virtue and excellence. And so just writing the calligraphy obviously practices the Arabic language, but it's also a religious practice. And also the value of the Arabic language in the Islamic tradition, it's very well known to Muslims. You have the Quran was written in Arabic and it was revealed to man by God. And so if you have a Quran written solely in Arabic, it's considered to be a lot more sacred than, or like held with a lot more care than a Quran written solely in English. But obviously they're both holy texts, so treat both with care. And this was the Chuhada Cemetery, which is in the center of Rabat. It's a very overwhelming and interesting experience to be like just brought face to face with like this massive cemetery. And this is only a section of it, but you can see like all the individual graves, and it's based on a Sufi principle of death and of the visit of the grave. And it's a really important concept to either visit your like a loved one or visit your late mystic master, because physically the foundations of the grave is the next foundations of the mystic lodge, but metaphysically followers can reap blessings from the tomb of their late master. So I went to the Modern Art Museum towards the end of my reporting project. This is a photograph from Moroccan photographer Ahmed Cherkaoui, and it's a very quintessential photograph of Moroccan mystic lodge. It's a zawiya, which that's like the Arabic name for it, but you can see followers practicing dhikr, or remembrance of God, in the middle, and you have Allah written in the center, which is in the Darqawi script, which is a Sufi brotherhood originating in Morocco. And you also have Hassan II, that's the portrait of the king in the 1960s, and under him was the Green March, which Moroccans protested in the Western Sahara sovereignty over that region. And the two things that the protesters brought with them was the Holy Quran and a portrait of their king. And so under his reign, it really solidified the connection of Moroccan identity, Arabic language, and the Islamic tradition. But also at the same exhibit was this photo. And it's obviously a depiction of interfaith practice in Morocco, but it was just a very interesting photo that made me realize a lot of things. I went to this exhibit towards the end of my reporting project, and it just made me think about a lot of the interviews I had conducted. I had talked to a lot of graduate students of English linguistics and professors of English studies, and it kind of made me realize that maybe I had handled this project a little differently. Maybe I was more academic, because I had entered this project with a very strong notion of religion and culture in Morocco being so intertwined, and that the Islamic tradition in Morocco could really only authentically be expressed in the Arabic language. But, and so I asked, this question to the Moroccan youth about if the Arabic language is the way of authentically expressing the Islamic tradition, then what does this immersive quality in the English language among youth mean for Islamic culture? And a lot of them said that, Morocco has a very much a strong history of openness and multiculturalism and multilingualism. Like in Spain, in Morocco in the north, you have Spanish influence, you have the Southeast Berber influence, you have Portuguese at a time, French and Arabic also have a lot of influence in Morocco. And so it was just a really interesting diverse and richness in Moroccan culture. Like my host sisters, by the age of 12, they both knew English, Arabic, Moroccan Modern Standard Arabic and Moroccan Arabic, French, and they were both learning Spanish. And so by the age of 12, they're already fluent in 4 to 5 languages, and that's not uncommon among Moroccan youth in Rabat. And so I just thought it was a really interesting way of kind of this anglicization. It's not really seen as a modernizing and westernizing agent. I think a lot of times in the West, even Arabs in the West sometimes conceptualize the Anglicization or the Westernization of these Arab countries, but that's not their identity to Arab people. Especially for Moroccans, I feel like they are very much seeing the introduction of English as merely like an addition to a very multilingual Moroccan identity. And so that was just something that I thought was really interesting, and something where I had to kind of change my my angle looking at this project, because it was just a different way of perceiving Westernization in the Arab world. So, thank you.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. I am Emily Cooper from Southern Illinois University, and I did my project on media literacy in Illinois. So the importance of this project kind of stems from Illinois' Public Act. So in July of 2021, Illinois became the first state in the United States to require media literacy education in public high schools. And so I wanted to include a little bit of the language from the bill. I'll speak on their definition that they provide in a minute, but they include 5 practices of media literacy in addition to the definition. And so that includes accessing information, analyzing and evaluating media messages, creating media, reflecting on media consumption, as well as social responsibility and civics. But in this slide, I really want to focus on this map that I provided here. It's from Media Literacy Now, their policy update from 2021, in which you can see that Illinois is highlighted, and it's the darkest, meaning that it is the only state in the U.S. to have some sort of law on this topic. The other ones that are highlighted have some sort of policy, but nothing to the nature of Illinois. And so where my project kind of moves to is I look at this requirement in depth, looking at the Public Act itself, looking at the Illinois State Board of Education and their role in it, as well as some external sources and references from the bill. And then looking at the impact and implementation of this bill through teachers, to overall understand how teachers are going about teaching this unit and this topic in Illinois public high schools during this first year. So just kind of like a little outline, I look again at teachers' reactions to this bill. In the bill itself, it uses the term unit. So what does that mean? Is that a day, a week, a month, a semester? As well as looking at what the bill actually does mean, and looking at the 3 parts of the bill, which I'll talk about in a second. And then what we don't know from the bill, as well as pushback the bill received. So looking at the 3 parts, they provide a definition of media literacy, as you can see here. It says the ability to access, analyze, evaluate, create, and communicate using different forms, including but not limited to print, visual, audio, interactive, and digital text. And then in addition, they have those 5 practices of media literacy, in which they have mentioned, the people that have created and helped work on the bill have mentioned to me that that was more for teachers to kind of expand their knowledge and be able to actually implement it into classrooms. But where it gets really interesting is the Illinois State Board of Education, according to the bill, was tasked with creating resources and compiling professional development for teachers. And so in looking at that in more in depth, I came across that Illinois is actually a local control state, meaning every district has control over its curriculum, so it's based on district-specific needs. In addition, they had no funding attached to this bill. So with ISB looking at creating these resources and compiling the professional development, they weren't able to create free resources, so they switched their responsibilities to an external group called the Illinois Media Literacy Coalition, in which they have created a framework and all sorts of different free resources for teachers. So they kind of unified together to create these materials. So I want to talk about the main takeaway. Again, like I had mentioned, the bill had no state funding attached to it. In addition, with Illinois being a local control state, they have really no plan to check on compliance. They have mentioned to me, the Illinois State Board of Education have referenced that they will look to their regional offices across the Illinois state to check on this compliance. As well as a big takeaway is that teachers have little to no knowledge about this requirement. And so I want to kind of show this map because I assume not a lot of people have geographic knowledge about Illinois. I looked at, in my reporting, Chicago and the Southern Illinois region to do so. And even though you can see here that these are almost 6 hours apart and about 300 plus miles away from each other, so it's a rural versus urban type of setting. Both teachers that I had talked to in this case had mentioned to me that they had no knowledge that this was a requirement, though they have been teaching media literacy in some form in their classrooms. It just hasn't been a structured specific unit. And so I kind of moving into the importance, as I've mentioned and talked to several of you already this past weekend, the importance of media literacy is vital. But looking at Illinois specifically, again, it's the first state to require this. So what is that impact going to look like? And again, kind of moving back to that map that I had showed early on of those other states that have some sort of policy, what is kind of the future of that for them, as well as other states that may have nothing on the books, as well as just media literacy in general. Again, it's the first requirement passed by law, so that is just a huge win, as well as just being able to open up the conversation about having and creating tools to navigate this new landscape that we all are aware of constant information and how to handle that. So that is all that I have, so thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you very much. Those were superb presentations, very important themes, and I think you showed us all why your subjects matter. We will start now with questions you may have for each other. Anybody on the panel? Go ahead, Kate.
So my question's for Laila. I was wondering what considerations you took to when interviewing young children, and also if you talked to any of their parents about how they talk to their kids and teach their kids about the occupation.
Yeah, that's a great question. I did take a lot of considerations. I was going to have like children sign like kind of a consent form, parents as well. But then when I spoke with people in the communities, they were a little bit confused by this because I think for them, this is their normal day-to-day lives, and there's like a lot less stigma than you would think around asking these kinds of questions and talking to children about these things because this is just what they've learned since they were young. So I double-checked everything with my translator and with my advisor who is in Palestine through the Pulitzer Center, and I made sure that my questions weren't too probing or too, intense for children to answer. But I was very surprised at how willing kids were to talk to me about their experiences. And yes, I did speak with their parents, and I didn't really include those interviews in my presentation, but I did write about that in some of my articles, and it was definitely an important perspective to have. I also spoke with educators as well.
Okay. Tori, I think you had a question, and then Safi.
So my question is for Emily, because I'm actually writing a paper on this for a mis and disinformation class at school, so we should chat. But I was wondering what you think, if any of your research looked into sort of pushback on implementing media literacy from like a curricular or on a curricular level in schools, in the sense that it takes away the responsibility of publishers and, big platforms and the like, or if you think that these things could go hand in hand, and different sort of mechanisms will be necessary to fully tackle the issue.
Yeah. Oh, is this on? Is this on? Okay, I think, yeah. So yeah, no, absolutely. And actually, in talking with various sources, they have mentioned that this actual unit itself is able to kind of go into different classes. So it can go into like English curricular, like language arts. Social studies is a big one. So they kind of go hand in hand. So in the sense of like pushback on like curriculum, not necessarily, because what they're trying to do, like the coalition that's creating these resources and kind of working with teachers and educators, they're looking at how to kind of help teachers in the sense of adding it to what they're already doing, and just kind of adding it to instead of a completely new curriculum, so that it kind of helps alleviate that. But does that answer it?
Go ahead.
So my question is also for Laila. You talked a little bit at the end of your presentation about the language when you're talking about the Israeli-Palestinian struggle. It's a lot of people use the language of conflict, and that kind of, especially in a lot of Western media, it very much takes away attention from the very like real struggles of occupation and of apartheid. How in conversations do you try to change that language after having like such an emotional experience?
Thank you for that question. Yeah, I've definitely, like, that was something that was solidified for me after my experience living in Palestine. I can't see it any other way now. It's so obvious to me, especially when you're on the ground speaking with Palestinians, speaking with children about their experiences, you know, driving from one town to another in the West Bank. Like, it is so clear that this is oppression. And the language that I use around this, I don't say the word conflict anymore. I say, you know, Israeli occupation, apartheid, Palestinian oppression, because saying conflict implies that there are two equal sides here, and that has never been the case in this. And that is a misconception that is used to delegitimize Palestinian resistance, delegitimize the abuse of Palestinian human rights, and, you know, pretty much paint a picture of a situation on the ground in Western media that is just not true. There are no two equal sides.
Okay, let's move to questions over here. Who has a question?
So my question is for Emily. And so I'm curious, kind of, as you're talking about your experiences with media literacy in Illinois, because we come from very similar states, I'm kind of curious if you've seen so far in your reporting kind of how the opinions of media literacy and actually teaching that in schools differs between a very urban area like Chicago versus some of the more rural areas in Southern Illinois.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's pretty overall, it's fairly the same, to be quite honest. There may be like a slight difference in terms of like ability to kind of access external resources aside from what the Illinois State Board of Education is able to, because when you're talking about like Chicago public schools versus like Southern Illinois, but overall so far it's been sort of pretty lenient and pretty level. So.
My question is for Tori. I was curious if you were able to speak to some of the students about how the lack of technology and access has impacted their mental health through the pandemic and what goes along with that.
So yes, thank you for that question. So I ended up not including a bunch of people that I spoke to, but I spoke to students about this, and I also spoke to one child psychologist who talked about it, and she had an interesting sort of take because she worked in clinics in both the barrios populares and sort of the wealthier, ritzier neighborhoods, more upper middle class students throughout the pandemic. And she talked about how sort of in the clinics, the experiences and conversations she had with patients were inherently incredibly different. And a lot of those stemmed from those sort of feelings of crisis and things like that, stemmed from things far beyond the classroom. She talked about how students felt helpless in helping their parents address sort of financial uncertainty for their businesses. Even the subject of my story, Yasmin, she spoke about how she felt her younger siblings definitely struggled with sort of uncertainty about the usefulness of education in general, and sort of lacked interest in going to school, doing their schoolwork, a disinterest from the community in general. So I think that was a really important question, and the implications are definitely vast. And so, yeah, thank you for that question.
Hi, thank you for all of your presentations. They were lovely. My question is for Safi. Did I pronounce your name correctly? Yes. So you mentioned kind of experiencing this, I call it American savior journalism, where you kind of realize that it's not so much Western influence as just a culture taking on for their own right and their own identity, something that we also see in the Western world, but it may not be exclusively from Western influence, if that makes sense. But did you also hear people in Morocco describing it that way, as, you know, as English being more and more a part of their identity? Did they describe that as being Americanized or Western influence, or just kind of a normal part of their cultural progression?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. I feel like I think people who are a little bit more conservative did see it as English and like bringing like secularism and certain Western ideals that were kind of at odds with Moroccan identity. But it's also really interesting because something I didn't include in my presentation was that in religious scholarship, English is now being used as like a major mode of communication, and that even though Islamic scholarship is based in Arabic, just within the Islamic world, that's kind of the way that people communicate now. So I was talking to a head of a religious organization, and he was saying that like Islamic scholars who don't know English are actually put at a disadvantage. And so English is now becoming like the language of Islam. So you have like that weird dichotomy with religion in the context of religion, of it being secularized through English, but also like a mode of obtaining more knowledge religiously.
I have the microphone here. My question is for Tori as well, and it's not meant to be accusatory. I think you have a really good answer, so that I want to hear it. I think I'd heard coverage about gaps in technology access for kids in the States during COVID, but I thought it was really interesting that you went to Buenos Aires to cover the barrio there, and I wonder, why did you think it was important for U.S. audiences to hear about kids in Buenos Aires? What was it about, why is that important for Politico readers? And
Yeah, so thank you for that question. So as I've told a lot of fellows over the past weekend, so I'm from Philly, my parents are from Philly, their parents are from Philly. I used to kind of think of it as the center of the world, though probably I'm in the minority on that opinion. So I was very interested growing up because I went to, just for some personal background, I went through the public school system until 8th grade, and then I was able to transfer into a small friend school, and the differences there just sort of drew me into an interest in equity in education, because my experiences in Friends School for High School and Philadelphia public education system prior were quite different. So I noticed that in crafting a pitch, I knew I wanted to do something education related, and definitely tie in the impact of the pandemic. So I know we definitely all read, hundreds of articles about sort of the toll on mental health for U.S. students, which is definitely pretty staggering, some statistics on that. And then I have a close friend whose family is from Argentina, so I was telling her that I'm applying to this Pulitzer grant and that I want to do something on education. So she's at Penn with me, but the rest of her family lives outside of Buenos Aires. So she was saying how none of her cousins had gone back to school and I should look into it. So I read up on some coverage, and one thing I thought was interesting was that even because Barrio 31 is so infamous, there was very few statistics about how many children lacked access to computers, how many children couldn't access a cell phone, how many children had dropped out. So just that conversation with her, and then learning more about the city, because I'd never been to Argentina prior, really sparked my interest in finding out what was going on there. So I found that more interpersonal interviews about experience, because there was this sort of gap to work around with statistics, was really interesting. And I think it really taught me that everything is relative. I work for my school paper, and I've been writing about educational inequity in Philadelphia for the entirety of my collegiate career. And so this, I think, definitely changed my perspective on sort of what the impact of the pandemic really is getting at, because I think in the US it has a completely different connotation, and I think that's really important for people to know about. So that's why I chose to travel there and write this story, which was an incredible experience.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, and thank you to everyone.